Hi everyone, good afternoon. It's a pleasure for us just to attend the IFSW 2020 online conference. A warm welcome to our brothers and sisters worldwide. It's a pleasure for me to co-author this communication with my friend Gustavo Frederico.
Hello, I'm Gustavo. We're going to talk about the Venezuelan refugee crisis, the work of UNHCR in Roraima, Brazil.
So for those who don't know me, my name is Filipe Duarte. So we'll be presenting a communication about Venezuelan refugees. So the number of Venezuelans seeking refugee status worldwide have spiked since 2017, principally in the Americas. According to UNHCR, Brazil has received more than 200 Venezuelans since 2017. So around 85,000 have logged asylum claims. So for those who don't know Gustavo is a human rights activist who lives in Ottawa, Canada. He is passionate about refugee human rights and issues related to vulnerable minorities. In 2019, he worked for 7 months as a data management associate for UNHCR, so the UN RefugeeAgency, known in Portuguese as ACNUR, in Boa Vista, located in Brazil's northern state of Roraima, near the border with Venezuela. So our communication will be presented through a narrative lived experience interview format that aims to present the mandate and work of UNHCR on the ground in Roraima, Brazil. So our main objective is also to contribute to understanding of the UNHCR registration processes of people of concern, asylum seekers and migrants, and the main vulnerabilities of Venezuelans arriving in Brazil since 2017. So how the UNHCR data is handled and will be also explored in order to explain who counts and who does not. So I have several questions for Gustavo, and I will pose the questions to Gustavo, and Gustavo will lead us through the communication. So first question, Gustavo, for those who don't know Gustavo Frederico, could you tell us a little about yourself? So what led you to leave Canada in December 2018 to work for UNHCR in Roraima, near the border with Venezuela?
Yes, have been living in Canada for more than 20 years. I am Brazilian of origin. My formation and my work has been in software development. I did see the opportunity in 2018 to work for UNHCR in Roraima, in Brazil. I saw the opportunity actually on Twitter, and I thought that that was an opportunity and at the same time an obligation for the global left to respond to the crisis. I consider myself someone who has progressive political views, so I thought that was a very good opportunity.
So thank you, Gustavo. You worked for UNHCR in Roraima for 7 months. So can you just give us some background about the UNHCR work on the ground in Brazil, in Roraima?
Yes, UNHCR, as you said, is the UN RefugeeAgency. It has a mandate to protect refugees and asylum seekers. In Roraima, Brazil, UNHCR works in an array of other agencies. That includes other international agencies such as UNICEF, UN Migration, UNFPA. The Brazilian government also has the armed forces. In fact, the name of the main operation is Operação Acolhida, or Operation Welcome, loosely translated. It includes the Ministry of Justice. It includes also NGOs, includes civil society at large, religious institutions. So UNHCR is in this context, responding to the special needs to protection of vulnerable populations at the border between Brazil and Venezuela. And it's working in collaboration with other agencies. The work of UNHCR on the ground includes a response at the border there, providing registration. It does provide shelter. It has 13 shelters in the state of Roraima for temporary shelters. And also UNHCR has, in collaboration with other organizations, an internal internal resettlement program that helps Venezuelans to find work in other places of Brazil, or to relocate them to where there are more job opportunities.
So Gustavo, just a follow-up question that was not in our plan. So you mentioned Venezuela's situation. So can you just explain why in Venezuela we call Venezuela situation, or perhaps in elsewhere worldwide, internationally we call just a refugee camps and different terms. Can you just explain to the audience the terminology that you were using in terms of situation,
Sure.
camp, or any different support program?
Yes, and just to remind, I don't work for UNHCR anymore. Just as a disclaimer. And UNHCR as a UN body is very careful in the language used, and there are certain conversations with other agencies as well as to the language. And so UNHCR at times describes this as a Venezuelan situation, being very diplomatic and to try not to characterize what is happening there as a crisis, well, because that has political implications. At the same time, UNHCR is invited by the Brazilian government to be in there, and it is very diplomatic in handling the Brazilian government. At the same time, for example, the Venezuelan situation, it has a very high level of crisis internally. It's categorized internally by UNHCR as it's not the highest level, but it's just one before the highest level of emergency in the characteristics of emergency. So it is I suppose is one characteristic of UNHCR that tries to have a tight control on language, especially in language that goes through media for mass consumption, while at the same time having certain care with language there in the labeling of, say, shelters as opposed to camps, or trying to categorize people as refugees and not migrants. And so UNHCR has a bit of a challenge trying to reconcile and be precise with language that is spoken by various people at various contexts, be it formal or informal.
Okay, Gustavo, thank you. So moving to the next question. So in the context of right-wing populism in Brazil and anti-Venezuelan sentiment since 2017, first under the presidency of Michel Temer, and then with Jair Bolsonaro, how Venezuelans were or are viewed and treated by government institutions at the border and by the Brazilian society at large?
Yes, I think it's fair to say that there is, in fact, right-wing populism thriving in Brazil, including the north of Brazil. The government institutions have an ambiguous response, in my view. In one hand, the asylum seekers and migrants, they're labeled as the foreigners, as those who come to steal our jobs, as we've seen all over the world, similar responses and views, unfortunately, to refugees. At the same time that they're taken as the other who comes with problems. The government institutions also have a positive response to the influx of asylum seekers, refugees, and migrants in providing for their basic services, including helping them with these processes of registration, with the response to basic needs, including food, emergency shelter, and the very relocation program that I mentioned. So I think at best, it could be seen, the response can be seen by government institutions as very ambiguous. Brazilian society is very similar. At the same time, I witnessed xenophobic comments on the streets, on the media, in the state of Roraima. While that happened, and it's very unfortunate and common, there are other beautiful stories of communities, especially poor communities of Brazilians who received and welcomed other poor asylum seekers and migrants in their neighborhoods, providing them with jobs, with integration, with a sense of belonging. Also, for example, there are beautiful examples of of indigenous communities in the side of Brazil who have a long history of ties to indigenous communities right across the border with Venezuela, the border that we know came to exist many years after these communities existed. And so there are positive hit stories of indigenous communities on the side of Brazil welcoming and sheltering other communities from the side of Venezuela.
Thank you, Gustavo. So moving in terms of to the UN registration process. So could you just tell us about the UNHCR registration process of people of concern in Boa Vista? What does people of concern mean in UNHCR terms?
Yeah, so registration is one of the mandates of UNHCR, and the scope of this mandate of registration changes depending on the actual situation and response by UNHCR. The Brazilian government does have good services for identification, and so that is a concern of the Brazilian government and not of UNHCR. In any case, the registration process is part of the overall protection mandate, and that includes registering people in the system of UNHCR. I have here a photo of a triage center in Boa Vista that has refugees and migrants, the majority of which are Venezuelans, waiting to be registered and to have access to documents and basic services. The registration process is going to identify these people with software. Is going to provide. It's collecting biometrics to help prevent fraud, to access to services. It's already thinking about the future in the case that there migration happening in the other sense from Brazil back to Venezuela, if people are going to need identification, if that ever happens. The registration process is also very much integrated with the overall mandate of protection. So while there is the process of registration, of knowing how many people are there, who is there in front of UNHCR, there is at all times the practice of identifying people in situation of vulnerability. And so the registration process, in this sense, is part of identification of vulnerabilities and the response to vulnerabilities of the population.
So thank you, Gustavo. So the registration creates data. So what the collected data tells us about the specific needs of Venezuelans. So what have been the main vulnerabilities being identified by UNHCR after entering Brazil?
Yes, UNHCR has software that helps in supporting processes of protection to vulnerable populations, especially population at large and vulnerable asylum seekers and migrants. In the case of Brazil, they have been using the software. It's not in every operation that it's not every operation that can afford to have software, hardware and software support these operations. The data is standardized all over UNHCR. There are categories and subcategories of vulnerabilities or specific needs. These are called persons at heightened risks. It's another expression that is used. And some of the high-level categories of these risks include child at risk, unaccompanied or separated child, woman at risk, older person at risk, single parent or caregiver, person with disability, person with serious medical condition, family unity, specific legal and physical protection needs, signs of torture, and sexual and gender-based violence. Beyond these top-level categories, there are more specific codes and categories that are, to a large extent, standardized. However, it may be of interest to researchers that even though these are standardized, not at all times, the operations and the realities on the ground make it so that the data is consistent, it's reliable. And so that's more or less the situation of the data. The data also can be challenged in a context of emergency response, where there are emergency situations that have to be acted upon very quickly, and so not at all times the personnel and staff can produce quality data that can be further analyzed. I should also say that it's a bit difficult for the public at large, not only researchers, but public at large, to know what the data tells, even though UNHCR has data on persons at heightened risks. To my knowledge, there is no reports that summarizes or aggregates the data on the Venezuelan situations for persons at heightened risks, even though the data may be there in the UNHCR system.
Thank you, Gustavo. In terms of the concluding question, so could you just give them some idea about the next steps for Venezuelan refugees in Brazil? So what are the hopes and the expectations when entering in Brazil? And then can you also share with us how other social workers and human rights activists like you can become involved with UNHCR, either in Brazil or in other UNHCR support programs internationally?
Yes, so asylum seekers and refugees from Venezuela have the same hopes as most of us have. They hope for a better future. They hope for having their human rights, their dignity recognized, having claims to these rights, having these rights to be concrete and have responses to these rights, have collective rights. They have hopes to find a job. They have hopes that their children will be safe and will thrive. They have they yearn for cultural expressions. So these are the set of aims of the Venezuelan population, as I could witness firsthand. At the same time, considering the political context of Brazil, considering the economic context of Brazil, the future may not look so bright. Besides the right-wing populism increasing in the previous years, besides having xenophobic expressions in the state of Roraima, these are things that make families worry about their long-term future in Brazil. The state of Roraima is strategic. It is the city of Boa Vista is far from the nearest capital of Manaus, for example. It's 9 hours driving from Manaus. So many refugees and migrants are choosing to stay in Roraima until there is a change of there's a change in the political context or in the economic context of Venezuela, who we know have been subject, unfortunately, to economic blockades and economic embargoes by different countries, including rich countries. I think another opportunity there is in there, answering to the second half of the question, for social workers and human rights activists. They can engage directly with UNHCR, working with UNHCR. I think UNHCR is a good institution. It has stability. It has a certain budget to help people work with vulnerable populations. And at the same time, UNHCR has its own limitations, its own history. As a part of UN agency, it inherited a history, a culture of diplomacy, of formality in leading, in handling and interacting with armed forces, with government agencies. And in doing so, perhaps it has not opened the door for dialogue with social movements that do exist in the state of Roraima, ranging from land claims to indigenous populations, to economical rights, to social movements that have claims on political inclusion in the political processes and claims for rights of the general population. So I think that's another opportunity, especially for human rights activists, to inquiry into these situations and to explore these possibilities of collaboration. I think there's also an opportunity for researchers, social workers and researchers from the academic community to look into UNHCR with critical views and try to understand its processes, try to question their data, try to understand the semantics of these data, what is it telling, where the data came from, and what are the statistical properties of this data, and so on and so on. I think there is a big opportunity for researchers to get to know how UNHCR encounters, what are these encounters with populations at heightened risks, try to understand the processes, the shortcomings of these processes, if they may exist or not.
So thank you, Gustavo. Since we don't have any opportunity for questions at the end of our communication, so I'm inviting you to share some final concluding remarks about your experience in UNHCR in Brazil, working with refugees or living with family, and also in Boa Vista. So could you just share us like some concluding comments, remarks that will maybe inspire also other colleagues, other academics worldwide to work with refugees and to advocate for refugees?
Yes, I think overall, my personal experience was a positive one. I learned a lot. I think there is something special when we are working directly side by side and with those who are disadvantaged, those who have with visible minorities, and those who are facing challenges. There is something special in being where they are, listening to them, and enabling them to be social actors, to enabling them to be the primary actors when facing their challenges. I think overall it was a very positive experience for me. I learned a lot. And if I have the opportunity again to engage with UNHCR, I'll be glad to do so.
So thank you, Gustavo. So in terms of concluding, just the audience can find us on Twitter, Gustavo Frederico and myself, Filipe Duarte. You can search our names. We are currently working on our more extended academic publication. We hope that we can publish the full article of this communication by the end of the year. And it was a huge opportunity for us, and we are thankful for this opportunity. So thank you, and I hope that we can connect in future opportunities. Gustavo.
Thank you, Filipe. It's a pleasure to be involved with IFSW 2020, and I also do hope that there will be further dialogue with these themes.